So yeah, and we're recording. All right, wonderful. I'll try to be extra poised now. So thank you all for joining me today. So I have a little note on my series of notes here. I have self-effacing preface written down. So Stephen mentioned that I've been working on this line of research for a while, and I have. So my dissertation became that first book, A World of Their Own, which was published in 2013 and 2014 in South Africa and the US, respectively. And since that time, I've published a series of articles on the history of women's sort of political subjectivities, you might say, engagement in popular politics in South Africa. Initially, this arose out of the, sorry, somebody's unmuted for a moment. Sorry. Anyway, initially that interest arose from a problem that I'm sure many of you will recognize. I had one of my book chapters, the one that was looking at women's politics in the segregationist period, was extremely long and overwieldy. I believe I cut about 100 double-spaced pages from my initial draft of it. And that really animated my interest in this question of women's role in early African nationalist movements, particularly the Daughters of Africa, which I published on a bit in the previous decade. And from that line of research, I became increasingly interested in sort of where a lot of these women who were so active in politics in the 1930s, 1940s, early 1950s end up in the apartheid years. And in particular, this sort of latter line of research arose out of my teaching. So my teaching in my previous postdoc, and since 2015 at BSU, now I'm an associate professor there, I've been really recurrently interested in how students ask questions about the role of women and gender in the struggle for democracy in South Africa. In particular, students have been extremely interested in the Federation of South African Women, in trying to understand how such a diverse range of women came together to form this movement. Right? Because I mean, we all know that the Congress Alliance as a whole was quite a big tent, but within the relatively small confines of the Federation, right, which hosted about its founding meeting, right, is hosting about 200 or so women, right? These women represent such a tremendous diversity of organizations, right, from groups like so-called housewives leagues that formed during the Second World War era, to the Daughters of Africa, which was initially represented by Bertha Mkhize, one of my favorite activists at the founding meeting of the Federation of South African Women, to the underground South African Communist Party, to, of course, the ANC Women's League, and all of the other Congress Alliance organizations that become so important in this movement. Right. And so really these questions that I've been getting increasingly from students and that have come up as well in my own mind as I'm reading and preparing to teach about the history of the anti-apartheid struggle, as I do quite frequently, it really is around sort of how women come together around this tremendous diversity, right? How women connect politically across these great differences to forge this very complicated sort of women's wing of the Congress Alliance. And so in other words, right, simply put, my interest in this project has come out of both my historical trajectory as a researcher and as a teacher. And what in this particular paper, some of you have graciously read and heard earlier versions of, I presented first at the African Studies Association online, November of 2021, on a fantastic panel. I think I saw Shireen here earlier, her name on the screen. Shireen had been initially one of the sort of progenitors of this panel, though she wasn't able to participate. But on that panel, which is about the history of women's friendship in South Africa more broadly, I also worked with colleagues like Sipokazi Magadla, Antabile Masola, who I think is not here, and Kim Miller. Gave another paper along these lines, which Jill Kelly, who I see is here, very graciously moderated at SAHS. And what's been really interesting for me in previous workshopping of this paper have been the very generative ideas and questions that audience members have had about the utility of this framework of the politics of friendship for thinking about topics, beyond the Federation and the history of women's activism. So that was my sort of self-effacing preface about the sort of long path to this paper. So what am I looking for here, right? So what I was trying to do in this paper, right, is contributing to my ongoing work of thinking about, how we can productively build on the foundational feminist scholarship on the Federation of South African Women, right, which so interestingly in South Africa has also been really, part of the foundational scholarship on gender more broadly. Right. So, Cheryl Walker's book, of course, which I have by my side here, should any questions about that and its connection to Joseph's work come up, that really has been sort of such a foundational text. And it's quite notable in that context that there has not been a subsequent book-length study of the Federation of South African Women written since, right, in the following 40 years. There's been a lot of really excellent work that's been dealing with later periods, such as Shireen's work, of course. There's been really excellent work in the space of articles and essays, like Nombolisa Gaza's work, of course, right? But the question of sort of, how do we take this scholarship further? How do we build on this foundational work on the Federation at a time in South African history and historiography when a lot of new questions and new methods have come to the fore, right? And so in this paper, I'm really thinking about how we can move beyond those earlier debates around women's autonomy in the movement, their relationship with male-led organizations in the Congress Alliance, and around the politics of motherhood, right? How we can both build on and sort of look sideways from, move beyond those debates by thinking more critically about women's relationships with each other in the movement. So that's sort of the first thing I'm trying to do in this paper. And then secondly, of course, I'm really trying to build what I'm sort of modestly, hopefully, calling a kind of intellectual history of the Federation, right? Trying to think about women's ideas, right? How women's political ideas are shaping the Congress Alliance and shaping more broadly enduring visions of liberation, which, as we know, many of which have not been fulfilled in South Africa and the world today. Right. And so in that regard, in terms of trying to think about the intellectual history of this movement, I see myself as very much in conversation with work by scholars like Atambila Masola, who presented a couple weeks ago here, and I really enjoyed her paper and her thoughts about unearthing women's political subjectivities, and scholars more broadly, right, in the scholarship on Black women's diasporic political thought, right, which is a really vibrant body of scholarship that we're seeing in work by people like Ashley Farmer and Keisha Blaine, working in a United States context. It is really interesting scholarship is, of course, coming out from many quarters, many of which are represented in this virtual room, around how women generate political theory, right? So thinking about women not only as iconic political organizers, right, whose bodies are taking up such symbolic moral and political space in the anti-apartheid struggle, but also thinking about women as political theorists, as generators of new ways of thinking about the constitution of the nation and the world. So in terms of what I'm looking for you, right, I really hope that the rest of this will be much more of a conversation and you just sort of hear me blathering on. I'm really interested in hearing from you all about first sort of where you would like to see scholarship on the Federation of South African Women going, right? Sort of what kinds of questions do you feel in your research and teaching, if this connects to your research and teaching, which I think it does for many of you, right? What sorts of things are you really interested in? What do you feel previous bodies of scholarship have addressed and not addressed about this movement? Sort of where do you think that we need to go in our literature on this movement today, right? Because it is, again, striking when we compare the historiography on the Federation to the historiography on other Congress Alliance movements, both how incredibly generative and rich it was, given that a lot of the early scholarship was written under tremendously difficult political circumstances, but also, right, how a lot of lines of debate appear to have been kind of dropped and abandoned over the ensuing years, right? So I'm really curious, where do you all want to go with scholarship on the Federation? And then, of course, germane to this particular paper, how persuasive do you find my analysis of the politics of friendship as it connects to the Federation? This paper, as you can see, is not perfect, but it is a full paper. And I'm hoping that with some revision, This paper can contribute to a planned work in progress that my colleagues who organized the Politics of Women's Friendship panel at the ASA have been shepherding in recent months. We're trying to work on a book or a special journal article on the politics of women's friendship. So germane to this paper, it's a sort of standalone piece outside of my broader interest in the Federation. I'm curious, how persuasive you think it is, what other questions you might have about thinking about the politics of friendship as a sort of gendered framework for analysis. And again, thank you all so much. I'm sorry my voice is a bit scratchy. I was telling Stephen I've been battling a cold for a week or more, perhaps. So again, I appreciate your time and look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a nice allotment of time in order to discuss this. Does anyone want to start us off? Please do indicate by the usual manner of raising hand or drawing attention to yourself in the chat, or even randomly waving at the camera. Does anyone want to get us started, or shall I do so? Okay, I'll do so. So I love this, I really did. And I think, first of all, it's very engagingly written. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I suspect others, including one who's just put up her hand, will have very specific, detailed comments to make. One thought that did occur to me as while reading was sort of a question about, well, what did these women have in common? What was the basis for friendship? And of course, partly the answer is the stuff that makes up friendship. But that also in this instance clearly did include some political commitments and also writing. I think that's certainly clear. Which then got me thinking, of course, about the kind of maybe a hidden presence in the paper or in the story of something like class or kind of class disposition. Now, obviously, there are indeed very big differences between many of the women that you're describing forming friendships, and some of the women themselves, such as Helen Joseph, who were very self-aware of what some of those differences were. And but nonetheless, I think it's that sort of ends up being at least lost in the paper as being about race, rather than perhaps something like class. So I suppose, or of course there's overlap of these things in apartheid South Africa. But I suppose what I'm asking is really, do you think that that too, that access to comparable, even broadly comparable levels of education, the ability to write, but also actually the fact that if you take Winnie Mandela, for example, she of course endured incredibly difficult circumstances. She was certainly comparatively elite within African society in South Africa at the time. So I think you know what I'm asking, and then we can take, after you've responded, we'll take a couple of the questions that are coming.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, so you're sort of returning me to old ground in terms of thinking about how we think about so-called educated African women's class position, right? And this is a very complicated question, right? I mean, historically, I've really kind of chafed against the phrase middle class, particularly to describe educated African women in the 1930s and 40s, which I've published about previously, as I mentioned in the intro here. Because I think it both sort of overstates the material privilege when we imagine a middle-class person that women had access to, but also because it understates the almost kind of celebrity status that a lot of these pioneering educated Black women had, right? I mean, so, Winnie Mandela, for instance, right? We all know, as a young woman, is a really pioneering social worker. She's featured in Drum magazine for both her beauty and her professional accomplishments, right? She's a really sort of exaggerated example of a broader sort of social type, right? And so, class is difficult there, right? And to in contrast, right, thinking about the white women from the Congress of Democrats like Helen Joseph, right? I mean, they have many different class positions as well, right? Helen Joseph is an immigrant from Britain. You know, her background is a very sort of difficult family background, and she's sort of running away from her past in many ways, but with a lot of accumulated privileges of education. She depicts herself as kind of a privileged dilettante as a young woman who comes into political consciousness, right? That's quite different, you know, to someone like Ray Alexander's immigration history, or to, you know, someone like Betty DuToit, right? I mean, there's so many different kinds of white women involved in this movement as well, right? So class is a very complicated thing. We know, particularly in South Africa in this time, as it interconnects with race, with religion, with all of these other categories. But I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, but I mean, I do think that's another category of diversity amongst women in the Federation that's quite notable, right? Is that not all women in the Federation have equal access to education. I mean, even if we just look within a given racial category, or more particularly, right, you know, if we look at like Black women from a particular region of the Eastern Cape, right, even if we go into these very sort of close spaces of analysis within the movement, we see tremendous diversity, right? So a big sort of base of the Federation, of course, are women from trade unionist movements, many of whom have very limited formal education. You know, many of whom are not literate, right? And so that, as I mentioned in the paper, is a space where we need to really think quite critically about the archive that we have of the Federation, right? Because the main archival depository at FEDSAW, right, those papers, which Cheryl Walker draws on canonically in her work, right, those are really important papers, but of course they necessarily privilege a very small number of not only literate women, but, you know, women who wrote quite a lot. Right? So within the movement, you know, I focus on Helen Joseph in this paper as a kind of preliminary case study, simply because she wrote 3 books about her time in the movement, right? She was very much the secretary. And as well, right, you know, Hilda Bernstein similarly has an enormous body, relatively speaking, of published scholarship, published writing on the movement. So yes, I appreciate your question, Stephen, and it's definitely something I'm trying to think more about. But I would say that within each sort of so-called, you know, racial category, there's tremendous internal class difference and diversity. And trying to think about a way to adequately capture class that captures both the material and the cultural capital dimension of things may be a lifelong struggle for me as a historian. So thank you for that question.
Whoopsie, unmute self. I have Shireen and then Prudence. Shireen.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Megan. I'm going to immediately confess to not having had a chance to read the paper because I'm in the middle of trying to do my syllabi and prepare for a talk I have to give tomorrow myself. So, but I did quickly skim it as you were speaking, and it looks fantastic and so interesting and so rich in material. And so I guess I have a couple of, like, I don't know if they're questions so much as, you know, just like a conversation. The one is that it seems to me, just from my first skimming again, while you were speaking almost, that there are 2 tracks in the paper. One is the politics of friendship between women. And then the other is what you spoke about in your introduction, which is intellectual histories. And you know, obviously I'm interested in both of these. I've been generally written much more on the first, on the intellectual stuff, right? And the you know, trying to make the argument that when we have to change what we consider to be the material of theory, and that we have to think about these fragments of women's writing and petitioning and so on as the basis of theory making. And then, you know, in the first book I did, you know, the argument I made was, when you look at it like that, you actually see how rich and diverse South African feminism was in the 20th century. So I can see how this work on Helen Joseph and the people around her kind of would deepen and enrich and maybe challenge, right? That kind of way of thinking. So I was very excited by that. But that seems to me like you could take that in one direction, and then you have the friendship, which is bringing into play a different set of issues. And so let me just talk to the friendship stuff more. I wanted to say a few things. One is, do you think that it's like, could we possibly periodize the conditions in which these friendships were possible? So, and it ties a little bit to the question of race that Stephen was asking about, of class that Stephen was asking about, because a lot of the early friendships actually came out of a shared class position. Actually, it came from the women working in the Communist Party and in the unions, working on very, similar issues as working class women, sometimes dealing with the ways in which unions didn't want to take up their issues and so on, right? So in that early period of the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, there's actually a lot of friendship that's built from working, from work.
For sure.
And that feeds into the federation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it becomes the shared working around different politics, not working class, narrow. I wouldn't say it's narrowly defined, but you know what I mean? Like going beyond shop floor type of politics to national politics and getting involved in the Congress Alliance, and there the possibilities for friendship, or the terms of the friendship, change a little bit, and you begin to see how something like motherhood becomes the means through which to articulate shared interests, and then that gets carried forward, as you know, I think sometimes in very problematic ways later on in that history, but there's no doubt that it creates the basis for cross-race, cross-class politics. But apartheid really begins to affect the possibilities of friendship. So like generations born after that are born into racially segregated social settings, and then they're born into a context in which open political organization is banned very frequently. And so I guess I'm just saying that maybe some kind of periodization might lend, combined with thinking more deeply about class. And what I don't think it is helpful. I agree with you to try to decide whether these were middle class or not middle class. It's also not entirely, but I do think that class mattered nevertheless, and I would like you to think through how class mattered, and I'm offering you one suggestion of how class mattered. You may, I don't know if you find it useful or not. But I think in some ways you see that the class question is also really important for complicating the ways we think about race. And that the questions of intimacy are also important for complicating the ways we think about race and friendship among women. That I think that there might be ways in which these are different for women than they are for men, and there was much more of the material of, it's like my problem with some of the stuff in the Sosky and Walsh book is that I felt it inadequately captured the intimacies of caring for each other and each other's children, and the food and all of those parts of friendship. I've just been re-looking at the stuff I did on Fatima Mir, And, you know, in one of in one interchange where she is at odds, you know, she has this complicated relationship with her supervisor, Hansi Pollack. But Hansi Pollack, nevertheless, is a friend of the family and has seen her. And she says to Fatima, I've seen your children grow up. I'm going to bring, while you're in prison, can I take them food? Can I take them coloring books? Can I do all of these things? So yeah, I think there's something really interesting here, and something gendered, and something that's not captured in this sort of Saskia and Walsh book, which basically is about the impossibilities of real friendship across race.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for all of those thoughts. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so as you're thinking, as you're talking about this periodization here, I realize a lot of what you're saying is also quite spatial, right? So I'm thinking about, so for instance, Emily Bridger's wonderful new book, Young Women Against Apartheid, you know, she organized, she's looking at women in the 80s, or young women in the 80s, she's organizing her chapters by different spaces of politics, right? So the meeting, the prison cell, the street, right? Yes, quite similarly, I think, I think something that is so interesting about the Federation that I think previous work has sort of insufficiently explored is this period in which the Federation is flourishing, right? So this period, you know, very precisely traces the kind of shifting contours in which political space is becoming quite narrow, right? To basically disappearing, right? So, you know, the organization is initially thought up in 1953, right? It's very much a parallel track to the Congress Alliance. And, you know, in Walker's book, she talks about their last above ground meeting happening in 1962. But more recent scholarship has suggested that the Federation continues having these furtive meetings, pretty well documented as having happened, though we don't know what happens in them, right, through the 1960s. Through as late as 1969, right? I've seen recordings. And then, of course, you know much more than I do, Shireen, about the resurrection of the Federation in the 1980s and how a lot of women, you know, maintained that they had a sort of continuity of political, if not organization, right? Sort of political imagination across these decades. So I think certainly part of what is so interesting for me about the Federation is that it happens at this really cataclysmic, important moment in South African history, but also brings together women of different generations in that moment, right? It's a very intergenerational movement as well, right? The sort of core leading members tended to be sort of middle-aged women, some of whom were mothers, others of whom were not, but talked about being mothers all the time, which I find very interesting all the time. But, you know, they also did have a lot of very young women who were involved, right? You know, Rahima Musa was relatively younger. You know, Sophie Williams de Bruyne was extremely young, right? When we think about the women sort of at the helm of those iconic photos of the march, right? So we have, you know, we have a range of different, again, not only all these sort of obvious differences of political organizations and racial groupings, but also, this complexity of the time periods in which women grow up, the parts of the country in which they grow up, right? There's actually, I think, a lot more diversity than the kind of stereotype of basically middle class, basically middle-aged, basically urban women, which is what I think we tend to assume the organization is confined to. But yeah, I mean, the spaces where politics are possible change so radically, right? I mean, if we compare women in the African Food and Canning Workers Union having vigorous above ground debates, right? Prior to the founding of this movement, right? You know, Frances' political coming of age, to, you know, the 1960s, where Federation meetings are literally taking place in a toilet in Albertina Sisulu's backyard, because that's the only sort of secret place they can find, right? I mean, just this narrowing of political space has obviously really tragic consequences, but also kind of interesting ones in terms of how intimacies are reconfigured, right, as you say. So not only, and what
just to say, not just political space, it's what apartheid specifically did to separate people. It's social space. It's the narrowing.
Exactly, the sort of intertwined political and social space, right? And you see that, I think, this is, of course, something that affects everyone in apartheid South Africa, but you see it so rigorously, so that's not the word I was looking for, so clearly, with women in the movement who are confined, in striking numbers to house arrest and confinement, right? I mean, so with Helen Joseph's writing about friendship, she's, writing about these meetings filled with longing across her gate, right? This sort of her social space and her political space have together been confined in a particular way that makes friendship more important to her, perhaps, as a sort of political strategy than it would have been otherwise, right? And yeah, I agree with your critiques of the Saskia and Walsh volume in regard to thinking too much about the limits of friendship and perhaps not enough about what was possible within these limits of social and political space prescribed by the apartheid state. And I'm interested both in this sort of everyday experience of intimacies, but also about how women talked about these intimacies publicly, right? And as other scholars like Barbara Kane have pointed out, some of how women talked about these intimacies publicly may have been lies, right? Similar to how the ways women talked about motherhood publicly, right? Something so interesting about the motherhood discourse, right, is how much of it is a lie, right? And so sort of what do those strategic lies about intimacies in public enable women to imagine and engage in, both in their actual lived private lives and in their public political lives? That's something that's again one of those questions that will always fascinate me as an historian, and I'm trying to begin to do some more work with it here. So thank you, Shireen, I appreciate that.
Thank you. So I have Prudence and Amanda, and I'm looking for any other hands. Prudence.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Meghan, for this wonderful paper. And trying to understand your argument, I think that you're arguing that difference does not necessarily mean separatedness, but a vision of diversity towards unity. And whether the argument is persuasive or not, I think it is. And I think you also, I have more of comments than questions. I think you also did a wonderful job with unpacking the complexities of women's mutual struggles and also representing Helen Joseph and other African sheroes as advocates of power of perception, who she believes was an activist, how her interactions with other women of different ways should go, peaceful and united, and how the world should operate free of violence and inequality. And I'd like to see scholarship exploring more on white women also being victims of racism, referring to Ngoyi saying to Joseph about her pink skin. I mean, as you've stated in the paper, it is this misrepresentation of women and the complexities of this history that affords racism and apartheid a different angle. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for your kind comments and feedback, Prudence. I appreciate that. So this point about difference, right? This is really something that I was trying to, I appreciate you bringing that up first, right? Because that's really something that I'm trying to draw attention to by thinking about the politics of friendship, right? Is this sort of problem, if we want to call it that, of reconciling with difference within the Congress Alliance more broadly, right? And so if we think about these debates between the ANC and PAC around multiracialism versus non-racialism, right? Shireen has gotten into this as it connects to women quite well, right? Shireen has pointed out that, it's really in the Federation, right? And in a lot of other, trade unionist movements, right? These interracial spaces that, this idea of multiracialism really becomes in lived experience much less important, right? And this sort of non-racial ideal becomes at least sort of temporarily possible, right? I think it's really significant that it seems to be women, right? Women in the Federation who are really sort of pioneering this idea of non-racial political subjectivity, right? So, technically the Federation is multiracial insofar as members come from these different affiliated organizations, which were racially defined in the 1950s. But in practice, right, the Federation is a uniquely integrated space, right? And so I think that and friendship is often the way that women, particularly I think white women, and I don't know if I'm saying particularly white women simply because white women have more writing about this period, or because their lived experiences were quite different in some fundamental way. But there does seem to be this sort of appreciation that within the Federation, racial differences could be acknowledged, but this sort of common program, right? This, as Stephen said in his early comments, right? This sort of common program of political action could be articulated. And it's this discussion of friendship and motherhood are, of course, inextricably intertwined, right? If we think about the quote that I began this paper with, right, Lillian Ngoy very strongly points out, right, that, they went together to the Union buildings as friends in their first march in October 1955. But that feeling, right, she says their friendship is based in the first place on the fact that our desires and needs for our children and our families are the same, no matter what the color of our skin, right? Is that actually true? Right? Probably not, right? No two women have exactly the same desires, I would say, for their children and their families, right? And of course, again, many women like Helen Joseph, right? As I see Shireen just pointed out in the chat too, right? She's not herself literally a mother, right? But she has this kind of fictive maternal role with a lot of women. Lillian Ngoy had a very difficult relationship with her own children. But this idea that through friendship, right, women can grapple with their differences and think about them in ways that become politically productive, forming a new mode of citizenship that is both anti-racist and imagining a new world, not just a new country, but in a lot of ways a new world after apartheid. I think that's very powerful. And I think friendship hopefully helps us to think about that. So thank you for your comments there.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have Amanda and Carissa. Amanda?
Good day, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Megan, for a beautiful paper.
Thank you.
My question, or rather my comment, goes along the side of making other women aware of the power that they actually hold. Because although most of these women who were part of the Federation or these organizations, although most of them were from the cities or from the urban areas, I think word actually got to other parts of the country about these women who are actually fighting and were actually activists against the system. So my question is, do you think it had an impact on the family dynamics of these women, especially maybe did it in a way bruise the men egos of, did it affect the family dynamics? Let me just put it as it is of these women. And another question, I'd like to know, did you find any information on the role of the women from the Bantustans, meaning the homelands, or how they contributed to these to this activism, or they were suppressed? Did you find any information on the women from the homelands? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, the question about family structures is again, the answer is sort of diversity of experiences, right? So, I think it's quite notable, right? If we zero in on Lillian Ngoy and Helen Joseph, the two women kind of at the center of this paper in many ways, both of them are not married, right, in their time of leadership of the movement. And that's very good for them, right? That really, I think, sort of enables them to have the flexibility to travel as long as they're allowed to before laws suppress them, right? But it enables them to have that physical mobility and that time and space to organize. Ngoy was widowed early on and Joseph was divorced. And, again, a lot of other women in powerful positions in the movement also are not married, right? And I think that is significantly enabling in a lot of ways. On the other hand, right, there are some women who are married, who talk about their struggles with their husbands over participation in the movement, as has been well documented. There's also some women that, describe their husbands as being very supportive, right? And, you know, women particularly from these kind of political families, right? The Sisulus being in a lot of ways kind of paradigmatic of that. So in other words, it's complicated. I think what's quite significant is that, you know, in the Federation's sort of founding texts, right, the Women's Charter and What Women Demand, and in the minutes of their meetings, we see, and in the memoirs of women in the movement, we see that there's this really strong desire to transform personal relationships at the same time as women are transforming the world, right? There's a really clear desire to make intimate relationships more equitable and more empowering of women's political subjectivity in space. And of course, we know that, you know, that does not on a large scale happen. Right? And I think that's one of the great disappointments for many women in the movement in their later years, in addition to grappling with the restrictions imposed by the apartheid state. In terms of thinking about rural women, yeah, I mean, I think that when we look at the individual networks of a lot of activists involved in the movement, often they have family, they have experiences in wide-ranging parts of the country, right? Which again make it very difficult to think about the movement as being a movement of urban women as such, right? So especially if we read memoirs of leading women in the movement, like I'm thinking offhand of Frances Bard's memoir, you know, descriptions of her girlhood are very peripatetic, right? I mean, you know, you have these family networks that are stretched out across the country, and that is important. There are also, you know, organizers who are moving throughout the country in ways that are quite important. Jill, who's on this call, is working on Alzina Zandi, who's a particularly significant rural women's organizer in KwaZulu. So yeah, I think, you know, there's tremendous scope for research in that, the sort of spatial dimensions of the movement. I appreciate you raising that point. Thanks.
Thank you. Carissa?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Megan. Sorry, I'm just plugging in my laptop. Megan, I have a slightly indulgent question because I've just recently seen some overlap with my master's research and FEDSAW. So I wanted to ask you about that. So when I was my master started out being about COSAS, and then now it's a little bit more focused on schools and the prefix system in South African schools, and then as it transitions into SRCs and today RCLs. And what I found is that in a few of the interviews and in some of the primary sources, COSAS particularly as a high school student organization, they reached out to FEDSAW and the other women's organizations like the Val Women's Organization quite a lot during the 80s. And it seems like COSAS got quite significant support from FEDSAW in that time. And I just say that because everyone interviewed just the connections between the high school students and the women seemed so, like the way people spoke about the women was like in awe. They were just so in awe of the support that FEDSAW gave them, and the support seemed to be serving on the precursor to school governing bodies, which were PTSAs. PTSAs in the 80s and school boards, I think, before that. So yeah, and I just wonder, did you come across any relationship between FEDSAW and high school students, particularly COSAS, but also I think just with a link to your paper, I was wondering about I think I see what you've written about FEDSAW women as mothers, and just that's, you know, the way that women activists have been written about in the, like, with that relationship of as mothers and activists. And then this stuff that I've found now, it's almost as if it's almost like the age thing is still there. We're talking about high school students and women who are older than students. but the high school students themselves were the ones soliciting the legal advice, the support on school boards, and almost like, yeah, and so it's almost, I guess, just in that way, it's not necessarily a mothering relationship, but it's almost like allyship, especially because of the nature of the students kind of guiding that relationship and asking for it. And so, yeah, I just wanted to know if you come across that relationship and what you think about women working with student activists, but quite outside of a kind of nurturing or mothering. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, no, you raised a lot of really interesting things there.
One second, Megan. Sorry, Megan. Could we ask Jill to ask her question, and then you can pull together? Yeah, Jill.
Sure.
Thank you, because I have to duck out at 5, or just at 5. Thank you, Megan. I've just reread this, and I, appreciate it and adore it. And it's been really influential for how I've been thinking about some of my own work. And I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about today, kind of following off of what Shireen had said about the intimacies, is I wonder if in thinking about friendship, you might want to talk more about the emotions involved, right? So one of the things that struck me as I was reading this again, right, are the number of times you get words like cared for, insecurities.
Yeah.
Joseph describing Lillian's outburst as a bitter outburst, or outburst bitterly, right? And I've been thinking about this kind of emotional kind of aspect here because I was reading Paul Landau's MK book, and where he talks about how all of these revolutionaries remember the moment the bomb goes off. But if you ask them to talk about what they did every day, right, that kind of mundane of organizing people and passing messages and gathering supplies, right, that gets lost. And so I think this might be a place where you can kind of expand this idea of friendship as a political theory, or friendships as a politics, right, is talking about this kind of lived experience and what we remember and project, right? This is kind of, what Rachel works on when she talks about these memoirs, right, of remembering feeding people, right? And so, how can we as historians grapple with these, kind of memoirs that very much remember these strong feelings, right? Versus the kind of everyday politics that are also happening. And the kind of second quick thing I wanted to throw out is, I also, when people point to that outburst of Lillian and Goy saying you're better off with your pink skin, it does seem like this kind of critical division between them. But I also want to think about like the intimacies in which Helen Joseph would take that seriously, right? That your friends expect more of you, right? And so they can say something like that to you and expect you to change your behavior, right? You can angrily say that to someone, but then you don't expect them to change their behavior because you don't know them and have that relationship. And so I think that's this other kind of intimate take on that, that criticisms are because we want people to be better and remain in our life.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, no, thank you, Jill.
So
Yeah,
Megan, sorry, 1 second, Megan. I'm sorry to keep interrupting. I just want to let you know I will have to hand over chairing to Pfizer, my colleague and head of department, in a few minutes because I have to run. So I just want to let you know that, and thank you as you do close together with, I think, some very interesting questions.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you. Thank you again for having me, Stephen. It's been great to see you. All right. So yeah, so to Carissa's point. So first of all, I've made the strategic decision not to work on the Federation as it appears in the 1980s, because that's kind of outside of the scope of this work. What I'm trying to research right now is really the Federation Alliance, the Federation and the Congress Alliance period. So looking at the sort of height of the movement from 1953, 1954 through the 1960s, the end date has been difficult for me to ascertain as I learn more about what's going on furtively in the 1960s. But I am very interested in this resurrection of FEDSAW and FEDSAW in the 1980s and their connections with younger student movements. As well, of course, in the 1970s, right, you have the Black Women's Federation led by Fatima Mir and Winnie Mandela, which is also very much a sort of successor / linked organization to the Federation as it appeared in the 1950s and 60s. And they're also, very much about links with the students' movements as the Black consciousness movement develops. So yeah, certainly these intergenerational links are enduring and are extremely important. In terms of my period, also the Federation is very much involved in the Bantu education boycotts, which, have been treated in the literature by John Hyslop, I think generally quite well as a failure, right? But it's a failure that, people put a lot of effort into, right? And a failure that I think some of the efforts at alternative education pioneered in that time period, of course, come back in later decades. Helen Joseph, right, put a lot of work into developing some alternative curriculum, actually. There's so many files, some which are kind of weird, of attempts to present alternative takes on South African history in the cultural clubs that were part of the Bantu education boycott. So that, yeah, that sort of politics of motherhood, public motherhood thing and education, very, very strong links there. I agree with you about thinking about this idea of allyship more seriously. And this is something that I think is going to be really important to my continuing research on the Federation, right? Is thinking about what it means to be in alliance, right? To be in alliance, I think is something that the women in this movement are thinking about very critically, right? To be in alliance is to, as Jill is also saying here, right? To, have expectations of people with whom you're comrades, right? Sort of pushing each other to do more and be better, while at the same time acknowledging that you have different struggles and different positions, right? And so thinking about what that means is, I think, really valuable. And I would love to read your master's thesis. It sounds really fantastic, building on my earlier work in education too. I'm always interested in that. Yeah, so quickly to Jill. Yeah, your point about emotions is great. Nancy Hunt's article, I'm sure many of you have read, I reread that recently, about the affective and intellectual in African history. I think it was from 2014 or so. That's a really useful piece. It's a sort of historiography, thinking about how scholars intertwine the intellectual and the affective. So how do we think about emotions at the same time that we're thinking about political theory and how people are generating that theory? Jill also mentioned Rachel Sandwell's work. I think, for all the grad students here, you should read everything. Rachel's published a series of articles, most recently a fantastic one in Science, which I was so excited about from the moment I read a draft of it a couple of years ago, that really does a great job reading women's memoirs, thinking about emotion as a sort of form of political theorizing in and of itself, right? How women think about pleasure in particular, right? Which a lot of earlier scholarship on the Congress Alliance years necessarily kind of glossed over as, being these accounts of joy, of singing, of togetherness, right? Often earlier scholarship was like, yeah, that's all great, but, ultimately, right, we know what's